Welcome to the show. Do we have him? Daniel Nichanian. He is the founding editor of the political report for The Appeal. It's a project of The Appeal that covers local politics, criminal justice, mass incarceration. He, of course, also writes in the political report and sends a weekly newsletter. Daniel, welcome back to the program.
Hi, it's great to be back.
So, Daniel, let's start with this. Now, if folks remember, you were on the program, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and you were outlining for us some races that will have the most important impact on not necessarily our immigration policy, but how our immigration policy touches immigrants in this country. And it was a fascinating conversation where so much we hear about policy is personnel. In this instance, it's sort of like it is the execution of policy is also a function of personnel. We're hearing a lot about the idea that there's a lot of laws on the books and the president has the opportunity to step in, choose which ones they're going to focus on and give resources to. This happens on a local level. So let's start with, and I know you've written about this, the races that you were tracking for sheriff. Remind us again why the sheriff is so important. I mean, I used to make a joke about this, but the sheriff is really, really important, particularly in the context of immigration. Why is that?
Right. A lot has changed since we talked a few weeks ago on immigration, maybe more than most issues because of President Trump and Stephen Miller are on their way out of the White House. And that's definitely going to change a lot in immigration policy. But ICE, based on everything we know about President-elect Joe Biden's policies, ICE is still going to be there in the picture. ICE is still going to go after immigrants, and when it comes to ICE's ability to identify people who ICE thinks are undocumented, arrest them, kind of put them in the detention infrastructures. Local law enforcement are often very, very important. Specifically, sheriff's department in a lot of places have a lot of sway over just how much local governments are going to be cooperating, either through contracts, through like actual formal on-paper contracts, or through a set of informal practices. And over the past many years, it's really been a focus of organizing for immigrant rights groups around the country that have really put the focus on sheriff's offices and sheriff's elections, because they're obviously elected offices, to really put the issue of ICE, the issue of cooperation with the federal government on immigration enforcement at the center of the elections for sheriff in a way that really is new. In a way that's really a new issue in these elections, and we saw in some places again this year success for that effort.
And so, all right, so give us some of the highlights, I guess, and the lowlights of that, because it also, I mean, I'm curious both obviously for the implications of the relationships with ICE and hopefully things will change to some degree under a Biden administration, at least the posture that ICE takes. But it's also indicative of what's happening in these communities and their perspective towards this stuff, how they reacted. So where were the biggest changes in terms of those elections with the greatest implications?
Well, what's interesting is that the South, again, was the centerpiece of the setbacks that I suffered. I say again because in 2018, North Carolina really was the emblematic state where a wave of sheriffs were elected in 2018, the biggest counties in North Carolina, on promises to end contracts with ICE. And the same thing happened in some very big counties last week. I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago. I forgot where the election is, in Georgia and South Carolina, and specifically in Cobb and Gwinnett counties. So maybe some of our listeners have really heard of Cobb and Gwinnett recently because they were really they're very big suburban counties in the Atlanta region that drove the success for Democrats at the top of the ticket as well. They really shifted Democratic, but that is not that the shift Democratic does not automatically translate, first of all, to Democratic gains down ballot. Also does not translate to the election of DAs or sheriffs that are running on actual reforms. Like we know from a lot of examples that Democratic sheriffs and DAs actually have cooperated with practices of the sort. But in Cobb and Gwinnett have had very long-standing aggressive policies towards their immigrant residents. The sheriff's offices in both counties have been very aggressive towards immigrants and towards contracting with ICE. And in both cases, there was really a lot of organizing by immigrant rights groups like the Asian American Advocacy Fund or Mi Gente to put these issues on the table and convince Democratic candidates to run on these issues, to promise to stop ICE contracts. And in both Cobb and Gwinnett, Democrats flipped the offices and sheriffs are incoming who have promised to break what's called the 287G contract with ICE and other forms of ICE cooperation. And that sort of organizing, that sort of activism could translate in a couple of months into energy. Obviously, the runoffs in Georgia is what we're all going to watch, right, over the next 6 weeks. So it's important to not lose sight of these grassroots efforts that have also happened in Georgia.
And Daniel, just a quick question or clarifying, can you talk about what that means tangibly for contracts to be ended with
right.
with these areas in Georgia, for example? Like, what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, so the emblematic form that the organizing of contract is what's called the 287G agreement, which really is the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the forms that cooperation between sheriff's offices and ICE takes. But let's just focus on 287G because that's what a lot of the conversation was about. 287G is a contract that effectively authorizes law enforcement at the local level to act as though they were federal agents when it comes to identifying, interrogating and arresting people who they suspect to be immigrants within the jail space. And this is something we talked about a month ago, Sam, which is that jails are really a space where a ton of people kind of go through, especially people of color who are likelier to be arrested. It can be for any sort of low level infraction as well. You can end up being booked in jail, even if you never convicted of a crime, even if you never end up with a criminal record, even if for anything really. And that under the 287G contract, those sort of low-level, constant, routine interactions that thousands of people go through a year, those become effectively immigration checks or places that local law enforcement can go after immigrants, and that was the focus of organizing to end that form of emblematic link between local law enforcement, which has no business running the federal government's immigration policies, to end that. And that was, this is kind of obscure in the sense that it's like a bureaucratic agreement of how to deal with people in jail. The fact that it became visible enough to become covered, to become something that candidate forums were really discussing, to become something that Democratic candidates had a position on. That is not none of this is obvious. I think I want to emphasize that, and it's not something that I see happening in some places where that doesn't necessarily have that level of organizing. We don't necessarily see this level of visibility for any of this. So that's really what the success is, as well as the actual results.
Was there any other races across the country where you saw something that was similar in terms of both outcome and that level of activism that raised, basically forefronted an obscure agreement that really had big implications?
If we're talking about ICE specifically, I talked about the South, but in places like Cincinnati in Ohio, and Athens, Georgia, and other places, the Democratic primary saw the ouster of an incumbent sheriff by a challenger who, again, was talking about ICE as an important issue. And in what's interesting in Cincinnati, for instance, which is a fairly large jurisdiction at the county level, in particular, the incumbent sheriff, a Democrat who had attended a Trump rally in the past, then endorsed the Republican in the general election against the Democratic challenger. The Democrat still won and is now going to come into office, which also is a reminder, again, of the lack of visibility to these local offices, that a sheriff in a Democratic-leaning county can attend a Trump rally. And, this time was unseated, but so many sheriffs like that, so many prosecutors, so many local officials escape that level of scrutiny, escape being contested, escape the visibility. So for every story like Cincinnati, where a kind of ICE cooperating, Republican-friendly Democrat was ousted in an urban area, there's a lot of examples where that level of visibility hasn't been achieved.
I'm curious about those, about Cobb and Gwinnett and Cincinnati there. I mean, do we see what happens in the other ballots in that district? In other words, like, is it the candidates who came out against ICE,
right?
Are they like, how consistent did the Democrat win in those districts? I'm just curious, is like, how telling is that race to, I guess, up ballot races?
Great question. So that will depend on the place. On Cobb and Gwinnett, Democrats did very well across the board. There was kind of a bloodbath for Republicans at the local level. In Cincinnati, that it was more mixed. The Republican prosecutor, for instance, won re-election. I could go into some of the debates in that race. So that was a more mixed. There are other sheriffs in Democratic areas or places that when the Democrats were longtime sheriffs that are Republican won, in places like Pinellas County in Florida and other places. Which is to say, again, one, that it's not obvious that the Democratic shift up ballot would translate down ballot. And two, again, it's not obvious that the issues that progressives would care about or reformers would care about would be the sort of thing that would at least be part of the conversation. So I think the success, again, is as much about the result than about the ability of reformers and organizers to inject these issues into what was overall a democratic shift in places like Cobb and Gwinnett.